Today we'll be looking at a story which isn't a widely known case outside the UK. Mark Martin moved to Nottingham from his hometown of Ilkeston, where he would set himself a personal goal to become Nottingham's first serial killer. In this video, we'll be looking at his background in more detail, circumstances that led to him landing in Nottingham, and the impact he had on those around him. Viewer discretion is advised for this one. Hello, and welcome to the channel. Our story begins on the 18th of October 1979, where in Ilkeston, Derbyshire, Mark Martin was born. Little is known about Mark's early years, but what we do know is that growing up, he lived with his mother and that he was an only child. His father, who again we don't know much about, was absent for large parts of Mark's life. This was because Mark's father was in prison, but as for why he was locked up, I'm unable to confirm. That said, it was rumoured that Mark's father shared the same prison as none other than twin brothers Ronnie and Reggie Kray, two of Britain's most notorious gangsters. As for the times that Mark's father was around, Mark alleged that he was often beaten with a walking stick by his dad. His time in school wasn't much better. During his time in both primary and secondary school, Mark was bullied by other children. He would be subjected to taunts over his mother being Filipino, as well as a teardrop-shaped birthmark underneath his left eye, the latter which would earn him the nickname Reds. While you'd be inclined to feel some semblance of sympathy for Mark, he was by no means a saint. One former classmate, who didn't want to be named at the time they were interviewed, told the media the following. Mark had learning difficulties, but he didn't do himself any favours. He was a troublemaker and would often get chucked out of class for messing around. He was abusive to the teachers and would swear at them. Anything would set him off. He would chuck his bag down or start throwing stuff across the room. Mark was a bit weird, really. Despite the bullying and his overall behaviour, there was one boy who would befriend Mark. He would meet Gareth Moyes when the pair were 12 years old. Gareth would defend Mark from bullies, and the pair would spend much of their time together, often visiting each other's homes. They would also go out searching for scrap metal to sell for extra money. But as their friendship evolved, Gareth himself noticed signs that something wasn't quite right about his best friend. Gareth stated that by age 15, the pair began smoking weed, although Gareth would say that he would soon kick the habit. Mark, on the other hand, escalated in his violence as a teenager and would go on to rack up a criminal record that included burglary, common assault, possessing an offensive weapon, and attempted armed robbery. He said that we'd be the next Kray twins. He was deadly serious about it, so I would just humour him, Gareth would later tell the media. In truth, Mark's aspirations didn't just end there. While most people are inspired by close family, sports stars or famous people, Mark would instead idolise the likes of the Moors murderers and British armed robber, kidnapper and murderer Donald Neilson, otherwise known as the Black Panther. Gareth even recounted a story where he once witnessed Mark attempting to smother a baby, all because the child was crying. While it's clear that by the time Mark was a young adult, he was consumed by evil, Mark himself believed that it all started following the death of his father. In a letter that he wrote to his probation officer in 2002, Mark said the following. "I was so sweet and nice until my dad died. And now I'm evil. How long till I kill? It could be a lady, pets, anything." But this isn't to suggest that Mark was stricken with grief, as any normal son who had a good relationship with their dad would typically exhibit. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Gareth Moyes would later say that, quote, "When Mark told me his dad had died, he was just laughing. I thought that was weird. When your dad dies, you don't laugh about it." By 2002, Mark Martin was now in his early 20s and married. The couple were expecting a baby boy, and while you'd hope it would have prompted Mark to settle down and do right by his wife and unborn child, think again. Mark was violent towards his wife throughout their relationship and was in trouble with the law because of it on more than one occasion. In 2002, Mark attacked his wife while the pair were in a car, grabbing her by the neck. He also struck her and threatened her with a Stanley knife. It's worth mentioning that at the time, she was still pregnant. The attack wasn't reported to authorities at the time. In October 2004, he was arrested again on suspicion of abusing his wife, after she sustained a bruise to her right eye and red marks on both sides of her nose, a cut upper lip, plus bruising and reddening to her neck. While physically abusive towards his wife, Mark insisted that he didn't want the relationship to end. He echoed this to a probation officer, telling them he still loved his wife and didn't want to lose her. Unsurprisingly, his wife had other ideas, and by the end of 2004, Mark and his wife had separated. After his wife broke things off with Mark, he upped sticks and moved from Ilkeston, Derbyshire, and moved to Nottingham looking for a fresh start. But instead of finding another place to live locally, Mark opted to live in a tent. The thing about this choice is that Mark did have a place he could call home back in Ilkeston, but he made the conscious choice to immerse himself within the homeless community. Unfortunately, Mark was not a welcome inclusion to the people he was now mingling with. Reportedly, Mark would bully and intimidate people for their benefit money, and although he had no history with drugs or alcohol, he would befriend alcoholics and drug addicts for the purpose of manipulating them and taking advantage of them. One homeless resident even told interviewers that if you knew that Reds was in the area, you'd go to the other end of the city to avoid him. Community workers also found Mark to be an oddity. They found it strange that he intentionally chose to live on the streets, but would appear clean and well dressed unlike those he interacted with. Still, what concerned them more was that he was a threat to those around him. One person who worked in the community for several years commented that numerous organisations dedicated to working with the homeless found Mark Reds Martin to be a psychopath. They would say that he was potentially a dangerous character and that he should be monitored closely. And they couldn't have been more right. By December 2004, Mark was living in his tent, which was situated on grounds near old warehouses just off of Great Northern Close, London Road. Built in 1857, the Great Northern Warehouse was constructed by Great Northern Railway and housed corn and grain. Hailed as a technological marvel for its time, it was later converted into a carpet warehouse before being sold by Nottingham City Council to new owners, with the intention of restoration work being carried out. But in 1998, an arson attack tore through the building, leaving it a shell of its former self. By the mid-2000s, the site was being used as a squatting location for the homeless and a place where people would go to take drugs. Martin, of course, would hang around this area, imposing himself in the same manner that he had done in Nottingham. But by now, Mark was not by himself. He had befriended two other men, John Ashley and Dean Carr, who themselves were both living on the streets. Little is widely known about the pair, but reports suggest that in 2005, John Ashley was around 34 years old, while Dean Carr was around 30. The two of them were often seen hanging around Mark, although it could be argued that their association with Mark Martin was more out of necessity, as there were no indications that the trio held any kind of long-standing friendship. Also, given the fear that Mark inflicted upon the homeless community in Nottingham, it likely made sense to the two of them to align themselves with Mark, rather than against him. What is undoubtedly clear is that in hierarchical terms, Mark Martin was the more dominant of the three, with Dean Carr and John Ashley clearly acting as his subordinates. Together, they would each follow Mark Martin's lead, intimidating and exploiting the homeless, using fear and intimidation as their most common tactic. But for Mark Martin, simply being viewed as an intimidating figure within the community was not enough. Mark held a dark ambition, and by December 2004, he had openly shared his personal goal with Dean Carr and John Ashley. He wanted to have an everlasting reputation as being recognised as Nottingham's first serial killer. This wasn't something he just said to scare them, or to anyone else he felt comfortable boasting to, but it was something he strongly felt he needed to achieve. Sadly, rather than raise concerns with the authorities, Mark's urges were left unchecked, with devastating results. In the late hours of the 24th of January 2005, emergency services were alerted to 55 Marple Square, Nottingham, where a derelict flat had been set ablaze. This area, in particular the abandoned buildings, was a hot spot for the homeless community to congregate, to seek shelter and take drugs. Once firefighters had successfully fought off the flames, they searched the flat and inside, they found the burned remains of a young woman. She was quickly identified as being 25-year-old Ellen Frith. Ellen, who was originally born in Chesterfield, was part of the homeless community in Nottingham and was described by those who knew her as being gentle and non-confrontational. She was well known within the homeless community, and it was said that she was a well-liked individual. However, Ellen was an addict. She would begin smoking cannabis from the age of 16, but would eventually move on to heavier substances. Before moving to Nottingham, Ellen had been diagnosed with cannabis psychosis and eventually moved out of her parents' home after complaining of hearing voices, telling her that her parents were going to kill her. Her father, however, would say that they had tried everything that they could to help Ellen get off the drugs. While she was no longer living with her parents, there was still contact, with Ellen's father saying that the last time they saw Ellen was New Year's Eve. When a forensics and post-mortem investigation was carried out, it was immediately apparent that the fire was likely started by another person intentionally. It was firmly suspected that whoever did so started the fire to either destroy evidence or make it look like an accident. Ellen Frith had clearly not died as a result of the fire, but beforehand. There were no signs of smoke inhalation in her lungs, and marks on her neck suggested she had been strangled. A hypodermic needle was also found stuck into Ellen's leg. As news broke that a murder investigation was underway to find Ellen's killer, the homeless community was in a state of shock. Thankfully, the investigation would turn out to be relatively quick, as a number of witnesses would come forward with information. One council worker told police that the day before the fire, they were carrying out checks at Marple Square. While there, they had spoken to a man outside of the flat that turned out to be number 55, the same one that would later be set fire to. The council worker spoke to another person across from the flat, who was also squatting there. The person confirmed to the council worker that the individual they had earlier spoken to said that Reds had been staying at number 55. The squatter would tell police that along with Mark Martin, they had also seen John Ashley, Dean Carr, and Ellen Frith enter the property together. As police officers made local inquiries around Nottingham, speaking to the homeless, they learned vital information. Those they spoke to would say that Mark openly bragged about killing Ellen, as well as telling those who would listen that he wanted to become Nottingham's first serial killer. Investigators then began an urgent search for the three men, locating Ashley first on the 25th of January, where he would be arrested and brought in for questioning. In his police interview, Ashley would say that while he was there on the night of Ellen's death, it was Mark who strangled and killed her. He then claimed that it was Mark who had set fire to the bedding that would go on to engulf the flat. He denied any involvement in Ellen's death. While authorities continued their search for Mark Martin, it was actually Martin himself who would call police on the 27th of January, where he would brazenly say, quote, "I think you want me for murder." Martin turned himself into Nottinghamshire police that same day and was questioned extensively by police. However, unlike his usual boastful self, Martin decided to instead stay silent throughout the interrogation, answering no comment to each and every question posed to him. After 3 days of interrogation, investigators made no progress with Martin. Frustrated, but undeterred by this, police would continue to build their case against Mark Martin. Though it wasn't without setbacks, as forensic examinations on Ellen's body found no DNA link to Martin, eliminating the possibility of connecting him to the killing via trace evidence. But despite this, The conclusion that Ellen was murdered before the fire started, coupled with the witness statements and John Ashley's own words, authorities were confident that this was an open and shut case. As such, investigators decided to charge both Mark Martin and John Ashley for the murder of Ellen Frith on the 29th of January 2005. But very quickly on, police were concerned that Ellen had not been the only victim, as word had spread that Martin had claimed that, quote, there were more. As word spread of the arrest of Mark Martin and John Ashley, rumours began swirling around the homeless community that Martin had not only been boasting about his ambitions to become a serial killer, but he had already succeeded. Witnesses came forward telling police that Mark had been openly bragging that he had killed more than one person. Not only this, but when Mark was charged with the murder of Ellen, it was said that he continued to be an intimidating figure inside. One person in particular that he would brag to would be Scott Sinclair, who was on remand with him at the time for an unrelated offence. He would tell authorities that Mark was telling people that he was Nottingham's first serial killer, despite only being charged with one murder. Mark would speak proudly and seem to glee in the fact that what he was saying was clearly intimidating those inside with him. Chillingly, Mark showed zero remorse over his actions, saying, quote, if you kill one, you might as well kill 21. When it became apparent that there was possibly more than one victim, investigators got to work speaking with the homeless, where the names of two women came up on more than one occasion, Zoe Pennick and Katie Baxter. Both women were known by many within the homeless community and were regularly seen interacting with them. However, neither woman had been seen since the end of December 2004. Katie Baxter, who was 18 years old at the time, originally came from Cotgrave, which is about 5 miles southeast of Nottingham. But at 2.5 years old, her family upped sticks and moved to Nigeria. They would return 3 years later, where she would remain for the rest of her formative years. After the breakup of her first serious boyfriend, she began intermingling with Nottingham's homeless community, even though she herself still had several places to call home. Katie's family background was a stable one, and both her parents and her older sister all said that she was always welcome to stay with them if she ever needed to. But Katie instead opted to stay at Nottingham's YMCA shelter. Friends of Katie believe she stayed here because her other friends were doing the same. Katie was also a huge ice hockey fan and was a supporter of the Nottingham Panthers. She would attend every home match with her family, supporting her team from the sidelines. In the months before she went missing, Katie became a treasurer at a group called Kids Improving Cotgrave and involved herself in various projects in Nottingham to help those who were less fortunate than herself. In essence, she was someone who was keen to give back to her community and help those in any way possible. But unfortunately for Katie, it was this kind nature that saw her come across Mark, John and Dean. Katie was said to have entered into a relationship with John Ashley. She would increasingly become distant from her family, and it wasn't long before her relationship with Ashley became violent. On the 27th of December 2004, she was assaulted by Ashley, and as a result, she visited Queen's Medical Centre, where she was treated for injuries to her mouth and nose. After being stitched up, her father collected her from hospital the following day, and Katie opted to stay with her older sister until the 29th of December. After leaving the home that night, Katie was never seen again. When Katie began no-showing at Nottingham Panthers matches, her parents grew concerned at this sudden shift in behaviour. However, it wasn't until they learned of the fire at Marple Square in late January 2005 that they would report her missing. Zoe, meanwhile, was 26 years old and another who was well known by the homeless. Her parents had divorced when she was around 3 years old, and by the time she was 16, Zoe was living in a hostel in Derby. She was arrested a year later for shoplifting offences, but in 1996, she fell pregnant and gave birth to a baby boy, which was said to have brought some much-needed stability in her life. Zoe would give birth to a second child in 2002. Zoe had a long-standing history with drug addiction, but at the time she was working to get clean and was in employment. While Zoe was also not technically homeless, She had a flat in Littleover, Derby. She opted to associate with the homeless community, and over the years, she would spend more and more time in Nottingham. By late December 2004, Zoe visited her father to collect some items from his home. She would last be seen in Nottingham city centre on New Year's Eve. However, her father had not seen Zoe for several weeks following her visit and rightly grew concerned, eventually reporting her missing. As fears grew over the whereabouts of the two women, authorities knew that they needed to find both of them as quickly as possible. But the outlook was not a positive one. Police knew through conversations with the community that Mark Martin would often pitch his tent at the abandoned Great Northern Warehouse and focus their search there. By the 11th of February 2005, police had identified the area in which to conduct their search and had brought in cadaver dogs to aid in their task. While there, the dogs made a positive hit inside one of the warehouses located on the far side of the site, near where Mark Martin's tent was said to have been. When police went into the abandoned building to search, they found a shallow pile of rubble and debris. Underneath, they found the body of a young woman. It was Katie Baxter. Having found Katie, the area was closed off to remove her body, as well as conduct a forensic examination of the area. 5 days later, on the 16th of February, police would restart their search, this time for Zoe Pennick. Shockingly, the cadaver dogs would again make their way to the same location where Katie was found, and just 2 meters from where Katie was recovered, Zoe was found underneath another shallow pile of rubble and debris. Investigators would later learn via Scott Sinclair that Katie had been lured to the warehouse site by Mark Martin after spotting her in Nottingham city centre. He supposedly took her there because he claimed she, quote, fancied him. But after they went into his tent and got chatting, he snapped and strangled her. However, Katie put up a fight, and during the struggle, she managed to scratch Mark's face, but sadly it wasn't enough. Sinclair then told investigators that Martin burned her fingers to get rid of evidence, dragged her out of the tent, and buried her underneath the rubble where she would later be found. While the coroners were unable to determine an exact cause of death due to the level of decomposition, they were of the opinion that it was most likely the strangulation which caused Katie's death. The testimony by Sinclair appeared consistent with their findings too. Regarding Zoe, she had also been lured to the same location by Martin, this time with the promise of 2,000 cigarettes. The idea, Sinclair said, was that Mark told him he said to Zoe that he wanted her to sell on the smokes and that they would share the profit with each other. After luring Zoe into the tent, he grabbed her by the throat and began strangling her. Like Katie, Zoe put up one hell of a fight. Scott Sinclair said, quote, "He said it was hard and she didn't want to die. He was punching her, kicking her. She wouldn't shut up. I just did her in." Afterwards, Mark removed her from the tent and laid her body mere meters away from where Katie was. Forensic experts were able to determine that Katie and Zoe were killed between the 30th of December and the 6th of January, meaning that Ellen had actually been the third and final victim. News of the discovery spread through Nottingham like wildfire and quickly became national news. Dean Carr was apprehended soon after, on the 19th of February 2005, and charged with the murder of Ellen Frith only. Like Ashley before him, Carr denied any involvement, instead trying to shift the blame onto both Mark Martin and John Ashley, despite witnesses telling police that he had openly bragged about strangling her. Additionally, charges were also brought against Dean Carr and John Ashley on the 10th of March 2005, meaning that now all 3 men were charged with the murders of Ellen, Katie and Zoe. While police were overwhelmingly confident that this was an open and shut case, the reality was that there was no forensic evidence to tie any of the men to the killings. Instead, they had to purely rely on the circumstantial evidence provided by witnesses, namely members of the homeless community. While they had been extremely helpful during the investigation, getting them to agree to testify in court, coming face to face with the man who had terrorized their community for months, could prove to be a challenging one. January the 16th, 2006. Mark Martin, John Ashley and Dean Carr appeared at Nottingham Crown Court. By now, all three men were being tried for the murder of Ellen Frith, but only Martin and Ashley were also being tried for Zoe Pennick and Katie Baxter's murder. The men would enter no guilty pleas to each charge. It's believed by some that they pled no guilty due to the lack of forensic evidence and the assumption that the homeless individuals who had earlier spoke with police would be too spooked to show up to testify. Even if they did, it's suspected that Martin was confident that they would be taken apart by their defence. If that was the case, then oh how wrong was he. Not only did all who were asked to testify appear, they did so incredibly well and were able to stand up to scrutiny when cross-examined. Scott Sinclair also provided testimony to the court as to what Mark told him while on remand. The trial would conclude on the 24th of February 2006, when all three men were found guilty of murder. Specifically, John Ashley would be convicted for the murders of Katie Baxter and Ellen Frith, and sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years to serve. Dean Carr, on the other hand, was only convicted for the murder of Ellen Frith. He was also handed a life sentence with a minimum term of 14 years. But as for Mark Martin, he would be found guilty of all three murders. Peter Kelson QC, who was prosecuting the case, stated that Mark Martin relished being known as Nottingham's first serial killer and that he positively enjoyed killing. Judge Justice Butterfield would say in his sentencing remarks, quote, "The facts of these crimes are so horrific and the level of offending is so serious, you must be kept in prison for the rest of your life. These matters were committed by you because you positively enjoyed killing, taking the wholly innocent lives of these three young women for your own perverted gratification. You have not shown a moment of remorse. You have revelled in what you did, glorifying the macabre details of these senseless, brutal and callous killings." For his crimes, the judge would hand down a whole life tariff, guaranteeing that Mark would never be freed again. While his story isn't as widely known as much as more mainstream serial killer cases in the UK, Mark Martin will go down in history as one of the UK's most evil individuals. His desire to become the first serial killer in Nottingham saw him target Zoe Pennick, Katie Baxter and Ellen Frith. While they were vulnerable women, Mark had hoped that by targeting individuals in the homeless community, authorities would overlook these women. But he was wrong. These young women were important to many people, loved by their family, and when they went missing, it was noticed. Essentially, Katie, Zoe and Ellen mattered, and it was this that brought down Mark Martin and his cronies. Thankfully, Mark will never taste freedom. Whole life tariffs are rarely handed down, and as of March 2025, only around 70 individuals in the UK are currently serving this kind of sentence. But the same cannot be said for John Ashley and Dean Carr. The fact they did not receive a whole life tariff means that they one day may walk the streets again. In fact, this may be the case for Dean Carr, who was granted a parole hearing in July 2023 after serving 17 years at the time. Unfortunately, I was unable to find out how his parole hearing went, meaning he may either be a free man now or still rotting inside. The Great Northern Warehouse continues to make headlines as recently as October 2024, after it emerged a Halloween event was being held there at the time. Some people, most notably a friend of Katie Baxter, believed that hosting the event there was disrespectful, and it made waves across Nottingham at the time. Thank you for watching. If you're new to the channel and want to see more content like this, click subscribe to stay notified whenever I upload a new video. Giving this video a like also really helps the channel too. Until next time, take care and goodbye for now.